Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. The one big beautiful bill has passed the United States Senate. Here to talk about what that means is David M. Drucker, senior political correspondent for the Dispatch. David, I'm a little bit surprised that it was 50-50, but it's passed with J.D. Vance providing the tie-breaking vote. Where now? I know it goes back to the House, but what do you think happens?
Well, look, I've always felt that this thing is going to pass one way or the other. I think the question is for those centrists among House Republicans, how do they react to some of the changes, especially dealing with the Medicaid reforms or the Medicaid cuts, depending on how you want to look at it. And then you have the fiscal hawks, and there are a lot of so-called fiscal hawks in the House Republican Conference. They're not going to like this bill. They didn't like the bill they sent to the Senate in the first place. But it's either they live with this or they get nothing, meaning the bill would die. And so I think the question here is, do they put up a fight before they accept reality, or do they just accept reality to get it over with?
That is, I agree with you. That is the assessment. I have my opinion, but what's your opinion? Do they accept it and move it to the president's desk on July 4 and look for the next win, or do they try and have a symbolic Custer's last stand?
Really good question. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of sound and fury over the next 48 to 72 hours, and then a reluctant, we'll just go along with it and pass it on July 4th. There is a chance, and I would, and I really wouldn't rule this out that they can't get it done by July 4th, that it's just too bitter of a pill to swallow quickly, and that they hold out for this change or that change. It'll be interesting to see what they're hearing from like-minded senators. Hey, we passed this, but we were really hoping you'd deal with it. I think there were a lot of House Republicans, or not a lot, but at least some that passed it out of the House, but figured, let's see what the Senate does. So it's possible it could slip past July 4th. I've always looked at the August recess, the end of July, beginning of August, as the deadline that Republicans were going to meet, because I think this thing is going to pass and get to the president's desk. But there is some momentum here, and the way they look at it, as well as, hey, if we get this thing done, because it's never going to be anywhere near to what we would like, let's just get it done now. We get our 4th of July holiday, and we can get onto the business of selling this thing, at least for those who want to sell it. And there are a fair amount of congressional Republicans that are going to want to sell this thing.
And there's a gamble involved in rejecting it or amending it and sending it back to the Senate. 50-50 doesn't mean a lot of movement. That's a very fragile house of cards. And it was a very fragile house of cards coming out of the House. I mean, does anyone really want to run that risk of a tax
Yeah,
hike
I
that
know.
big?
Well, it's not just that, the way I've looked at this is House Republicans have thrown everything into this bill that they care about just about. It's like a policy omnibus bill. And so, what do you go to the voters with next year if you don't pass this? Because they could have worked on a whole bunch of this stuff outside of reconciliation, or they could have at least done two bills, two reconciliation bills, the way Senate Republicans wanted initially. And they might have been able to say to themselves, all right, we have time to work on this because we've got all this other stuff, but they've thrown it all in here. So if this thing, were to fail, they're really empty-handed next year, and I think Republican voters, would look at them and say, like, you couldn't do anything. What's the point of us even showing up? Um, and and so when you're looking at this bill, I think that the small majorities, in a sense, then work for the bill's passage, because everybody's on the hook if it fails, right? When you have a large majority, which it could make it easier in a sense, 10 or 20 members can say, hey, not my problem. You guys want it so bad, you do it, right? But here, three members hold out and the whole thing's dead. Four members hold out, the whole thing's dead. So everybody's got to answer for it. And that, I think, is why it's been able to actually get to this point this quickly, because nobody could declare that it wasn't their responsibility. It's been everybody's responsibility.
So, David, you did remind me of something that matters a lot. When the initial jockeying was taking place in January, some senators said, let's go with two reconciliation bills. We can do that. I assume they can still do a second reconciliation bill. Can't they fob off the malcontents onto the second reconciliation bill and start to move that immediately?
I don't think so because there's just not the bandwidth, right? Congress, it would seem like you can, and I mean, you in theory you could, but the oxygen to do anything else other than focus on this is just completely like there's no other mental or political bandwidth for House and Senate Republicans to do anything else. And so you have to clear the decks on this one before you get started on something else major, whether it's a reconciliation package or not. But you're right; they still can do a second reconciliation package. I always believe that they should have done the border reconciliation package separate. You move that first because it's something that everybody believes in, has the most broadly political buy-in across the political spectrum for voters, and it creates governing momentum. And then you deal with the sorts of things, entitlement programs, tax cuts, that are always political hot buttons that half the country's not going to like, depending on who the president is. But they chose to do it this way, thinking that it was just too heavy a lift to to do things twice. So it's actually will be interesting here to see what they do turn to next.
I do like the idea of too big to fail and putting it all in. Mostly, I like the idea of giving the economy a jolt so it has time to grow before we get into the next election cycle. Want to switch subjects on you, David, for a last question. June of 2025, if you include the first 3 days of July, is about as good a month politically as any president of my lifetime has ever had. Agree or disagree?
I don't know that I don't know that I agree, but I don't necessarily disagree. It's just that you have to look at different presidents in different eras. I mean, I can remember a time when George Herbert Walker Bush was at 90% approval because of the Gulf War. I can think of George W. Bush immediately after 9/11. I can think of, I'm was a little young during the Reagan administration, but I remember him being president and he had some real high moments. Donald Trump has had some real high points at times. I think the how he handled the Israeli-Iran conflict, getting involved at the very end to destroy or at least degrade Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, is a high point. So this is not my way of saying, oh no, he's not having a good couple of days. I don't know that I would put it quite like that, just given the breadth of history and different presidents.
Go back and give it a think, because
moments.
I remember '89 when the wall fell, but except for that, we've had comeback weeks like after getting slammed on 9/11, but this is just a week of wins. David M. Drucker on X. Thank you, David.